Hello from our studios in Southern California. Welcome to another episode of Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, we're going to talk about taking a different approach to running a marathon. This is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, for about 20 years at least. And I notice a lot of things by looking at what other runners do and looking at social media. And the marathon seems to be the holy grail. Everybody wants to run a marathon. They think you're not a runner if you haven't run a marathon. And so a lot of people are enamored with the marathon, which is great. And so they jump right in to marathon training. They do a lot of long runs and they build up their weekly mileage, and that's all fine and good. But for people who want to become better at the marathon, like really reach a higher level of performance, then it takes more than just the endurance work to do that. And so what I want to talk about today is taking a speed approach, at least initially, to the marathon and worry about the endurance work later. So speed first, endurance later, rather than the opposite, which is the way most people train. They train the endurance first, and then if they do any speed at all, usually that comes later. And so there's a few reasons to do this. So let's look at an example. Say you have run a 3:15 marathon. That's 7:26 per mile pace. And your goal is to run under 3 hours. So at 2:59.59, that would be 6:52 pace. So to go from a 3:15 marathon to a 2:59 marathon, you're looking at improving your pace from 7:26 to 6:52. That's a big leap. Now, say your 1 mile PR is 6:20. And your goal is to go from a 3:15 marathon to a sub 3 hour marathon. If your 1 mile PR is 6:20, or let's even make it more extreme. Say your 1 mile PR is 6 minutes. If your 1 mile PR is 6 minutes, then it's not going to be possible to run 6:52 pace for 26.2 miles continuously if you can only run 1 mile in 6 minutes, or in 6:10, or in 6:20. If you're in the low sixes for 1 mile, it's not going to be possible to run 6:52s for an entire marathon. And so if you're currently at around 3:15, and your goal is to run under 3, then it is better to first work on your speed, especially if you are one of those runners who went right to the marathon and don't have a background of speed. If you don't have a background of doing those anaerobic workouts, if you don't have a background of doing the short races, you can learn a lot from looking at what elite runners do. It's amazing to me how many people run who don't follow the sport. People follow basketball and football and baseball, even though they don't participate in those sports, because you can't. One of the things that makes running unique is that you could be on the starting line with a world record holder. No other sport do the commoners compete with the best in the world. In football, that doesn't happen. In basketball, it doesn't happen. In baseball, you can't take the field. The World Series is going on now. I'm a big baseball fan. You can't take the field with the Dodgers and the Rays. You can't take the field with them if you're just a recreational baseball player. But in running, you got the best in the world on the same starting line in the same race as everybody else. And that's one of the great things about running. You can rub elbows with the best. And so you can learn a lot from watching the best. And if you notice, the best marathon runners in the country and in the world started on the track. They had a very extensive track career and a successful track career before they moved up in distance to the marathon. Nobody at the elite level is starting at the marathon. You look at the world record holder marathon, Eliud Kipchoge from Kenya. In fact, just the other day I was watching a video of the 2004 Olympics 5,000 meter final, and Eliud was in the lead with 200 meters to go, and he ended up getting outkicked by Hisham El Garouche, the world record holder in the 1,500 meters, and Kenenisa Bekele, one of the best runners in the world, and Eliud Kipchoge got third in that race. He got the bronze medal, and Bekele got second. This was back in 2004. And so now here we are in 2020, and the two fastest male marathoners ever were in that race. They got second and third in the 5,000 meters on the track all the way back in 2004. They were running in the very low 13s for a 5K. And of course, Bekele went on to set the world record at 5K, and he was running like 12:37 or something like that, 12:30 something. So the point is that all of these people who we watch in the marathon, they were all excellent runners on the track. They all had a lot of speed, and then later in their careers, they move up in distance to the marathon. Nobody is coming from the ultra marathon world coming down to the marathon, because that's impossible to do. Nobody's doing that. And hardly anybody is starting out at the marathon and becoming elite. They all started on the track. In the U.S., that we always watch, Meb Keflezighi, he's like the heralded marathoner in the U.S. Well, Meb Keflezighi used to hold the American record at 10,000 meters on the track. In fact, I was lucky enough to be at the race at Stanford a long time ago when Meb Keflezighi broke the American record in the 10K on the track. And so all of these marathoners had very good speed. They were very fast on the track before they moved up to the marathon. And so now we look at the population as a whole, and everybody's going right to the marathon without having the speed background first. And that's fine if your goal is to run recreational marathons and you just want to have fun running marathons and tour the world running marathons. That's fine. That's what a lot of people do. But if your goal is to reach a higher level of performance, and so like the example I gave, if you're currently at around 3:15 and your goal is to get under 3 hours, that's not going to happen unless you are able to improve your speed first. And so the example I just gave, like if you can run a mile in 6:05 or 6:10, you're not going to be able to hold 6:52s for 26 miles in a row. You're going to have to get faster first and then work on the endurance to hold a higher fraction of that speed. And so you could think of it as having a speed reserve. To be good, even at the marathon, to be really good at it, you have to have a speed reserve. Because no matter what race we run, we're always running at some fraction of our speed. And that's why, ultimately, if you take a group of distance runners, and you want to know who's the best distance runner in that group, have them race 400 meters or 800 meters, even though that's a much shorter race, because you're always running at a higher fraction, a high fraction of your speed, or some fraction of your speed, that the distance runners who have the fastest basic speed are going to be the best at any given race. And we see that all the time. And you see that in track, how everyone moves up in distance, nobody moves down. You don't have, like I said before, you don't have marathoners who are ever moving down to the track. Once they have moved up to the marathon in their career, they stay at the marathon. Nobody's going the other way. Nobody is starting out at the marathon, and then later in their career, they move down to the track. And no one, and even in the track races, nobody who is at the world-class level at the 5K and 10K moves down to the 1,500 or mile. Nobody who's elite at the 1,500 meters or mile is moving down to the 800. It's always the other way. You see 800-meter runners moving up to the 1,500, and 1,500-meter runners moving up to the 5K, and 5K, 10K runners moving up to the marathon. You never see it go the other way. And the question is, why? Why can't you go the other way? And one of the reasons for that is because speed is mostly genetic. You're either fast or you're not fast. But endurance is very trainable. And so it is much, much easier to take someone who's got basic natural speed and improve their endurance to hold a higher fraction of that speed than it is to go the other way. Someone who's got great endurance and try to make them fast. That's very difficult, if not impossible, to do. A lot of that has to do with the fast-twitch muscle fibers. Track coaches have had a saying for a long time that sprinters are born and distance runners are made. And there's a lot of truth to that. And so it's very difficult to go backwards, to drop down into a shorter, faster race. It's much, much easier to go the other way, to take the basic speed that you have and then try to hold a higher fraction of that speed and try to last for as long as possible. And so that teaches us something about the marathon. So once you're at the marathon, you're kind of stuck there because it's very difficult to go back. But if you're interested in improving your performance, if you don't already have that speed background, then it is very valuable to work on that for some time and try to improve your basic speed, or how fast you can run 800 meters or 1 mile. And then once you spend some time on that and train those fast twitch muscle fibers and train anaerobic metabolism and give yourself more of a speed reserve, then you can return to the endurance work and try to work on maintaining a high fraction of that new speed that you now have. Now, there's some caveats there. Like, for one, if you're older, that's going to be hard to do because it's hard to get that. If you don't already have the speed, if you're 50 years old and you haven't had the speed to begin with, you're not going to get it when you're 50 or even when you're over 40. It's very difficult to do that. You know, it pays to work on that when you're younger. You can still benefit from it when you're older because the fast twitch fibers have atrophied after so many years of not using them. You know, there's a lot of truth to use it or lose it. And so you need to still train those fast twitch muscle fibers when you get older, whether that comes in the form of heavy, powerful strength training or sprinting on the track. You know, it can come in a number of different forms, but you still have to spend time on training those fast twitch muscle fibers, especially if you've never done it before. If you've never done it before, you're only going to be able to get so fast in a marathon because now you're just hammering with the endurance. And so that's what a lot of people end up doing. A lot of recreational runners, even good recreational runners, like a 3:15 marathon, that's pretty good recreational runner. Even good recreational runners, it's as if they just try to keep hammering that endurance nail into the wall. They keep hammering with the endurance, the mileage, the tempo runs, the long runs. They keep hammering the endurance, and that's only going to get you so far. How are you going to go from a 3:15 marathon to a sub 3 hour marathon if you just keep hammering with the endurance? You can't run a marathon only 30 seconds per mile slower than your mile PR. That even the best in the world don't do that. When Eliud Kipchoge broke the world record in the marathon, I think it was like 45 seconds or so. Yeah, I think it was about 45 because his mile PR is 3:50, and he's running a 4:36 pace or something like 4:35 pace for a marathon. So he's running about 45 seconds per mile slower to run a marathon than he can run 1 mile. But number one, he's the best in the world, and so he has endurance capabilities that nobody else has. And number two, at that level, the marathon's only taking 2 hours. For someone who takes 3 hours to run a marathon, you can't expect to run as close to your mile PR as Eliud Kipchoge can because it's taking you an hour longer to run the race. The longer it takes you to run a race, the further away you're going to be from your 1 mile PR because it's simply taking longer. So how are you going to be able to run 45 seconds per mile slower than your mile PR in a 3 hour marathon when Eliud Kipchoge, the best marathon in the world, can do it for 2 hours? And so you need more of a cushion there. You need more wiggle room. You're not going to be able to run a marathon only 45 seconds a mile slower than your 1 mile PR. And so if you are at 3:15, you want to get to 3, or you can make this judgment for anything. If you're 3:30 and you want to get to 3:05, it's the same idea. That in order to make that big of a leap, then you can't just keep hammering with the endurance. You have to be able to improve your basic speed first, and then work on holding a higher fraction of that speed. The physiological corollary to this is to first work on your VO2 max, and then work on your ability to maintain a high fraction of that VO2 max for a long period of time. The best marathoners are running at a higher relative intensity than the masses of recreational runners. So they're running at a higher fraction of their VO2 max for the entire marathon compared to everybody else. And there's a few reasons why they can do that. One is genetic ability, that they just have an ability to hold a high fraction of their aerobic engine. You can think of the VO2 max as the size of your aerobic engine, and then your goal is to try to hold as high of a fraction or percentage of that aerobic engine as possible. That's the key to the marathon. And so, the physiology behind it is to first work on the VO2 max, which is more centrally or cardiac limited than it is peripheral and muscular limited. There's two sides to the VO2 max. One is the cardiovascular aspect, the ability for the heart to pump blood and oxygen, and then the other side is the muscular side, the mitochondria, the enzymes, the ability to use the available oxygen that's being delivered to it to resynthesize ATP for muscle contraction through aerobic metabolism. And so all the mileage and the tempo runs, all that stuff focuses on the muscular side, the building up of the mitochondria, the enzymes, the capillaries, all of that. The interval training, the faster interval work, is really what focuses on the heart, and focuses on the heart as a muscle to be able to make it a stronger, more powerful muscle. So with every squeeze of that left ventricle, you get a bigger stroke volume, and that's the biggest difference between runners cardiovascularly, is the stroke volume. And so the physiological corollary to working on the speed first and then maintain a high fraction of speed is to work on the VO2 max first, because the VO2 max is the king of performance, regardless of the race distance. You must raise the VO2 max if you want to be a better distance runner, regardless if you're running 800 meters or the marathon or anything in between. That the VO2 max is the single biggest indicator of performance. It only is not such a good indicator of performance when you have a group of people who have similar VO2 max values. Then you can't separate them on their VO2 max. But in a heterogeneous population, the VO2 max explains most of the difference in performance in the marathon or any other race. And so as the single most important factor, then it helps to improve that, get the VO2 max as high as possible initially, and then work on maintaining a high fraction of the VO2 max. So instead of running a marathon here, if this is your VO2 max, instead of running a marathon here, you can run a marathon here. And that difference is going to be huge for your performance, and you'll run a much faster marathon. But if your VO2 max is here, and you're here, and you keep trying to nudge that endurance up, you're only going to be able to get it up so high. But if you can raise the VO2 max to here, now you have more room to try to move that ability to maintain a high fraction of that. Now you have more room to work with. And so that's the physiology side behind the practical side of working on the speed first and then the endurance. So that's really the way to attack the marathon. It's a new way of training for a marathon. It's a different way of looking at it. To train for a marathon, if you don't already have good speed, if you don't have a background in that, like people who, I've trained a lot of people who come from the track and then they run the marathon. They don't need to take that approach. If you already have a good track background and you've already run a fast mile, a fast 5K, you've got natural good speed, then harness that. You don't need to go backward. You can use that speed and then take it to the marathon. But if you don't have the experience on the track, running track races, running fast 5Ks, even off the track, if you don't have that background, if you don't have the interval background behind you, that you have never done anaerobic interval training, if you haven't done any of that and you've just been training slow twitch muscle fibers for 10 years, then it's going to be very helpful to work backwards a little bit and try to put some speed in those legs that haven't been there ever and work that first. And it doesn't take that long, because speed training doesn't need to be as long as endurance training. The speed comes a lot faster than the aerobic endurance. Aerobic endurance takes a lot longer to develop. The aerobic side takes a lot longer than the anaerobic side. So you don't need to spend 6 months training anaerobically. Maybe give yourself 2 months of doing that. Start with 1 workout a week and then maybe do 2 workouts a week, and do that for just a couple of months and see how much faster you can get. And then take the aerobic approach and then see if you can work on the tempo runs and everything that you need to try to maintain a higher fraction of that speed. And you'll be a lot more successful at the marathon rather than just trying to keep hammer with the endurance work, because that's only going to get you so far. Now, having said that, again, it depends on what your goals are. If you just want to run marathons for the fun of it, you want to travel the world when we're allowed to travel again, if you want to just travel the world running marathons, then that's fine. Then keep training the endurance. But if your goal is to actually get faster and get significantly faster, like if you just can't keep hammering with the endurance, yeah, you'll get faster. You may be able to chop off a few minutes, and the faster you get, the smaller the increments and improvement will come. Like if you're at 3:15, maybe you can get to 3:13, maybe 3:12. You'll be able to keep chipping away for a while, but eventually you're going to get to a point where you're just not going to get any faster because you're getting too close to your basic speed, and there's no speed reserve there anymore. Like I said, you're not going to be able to run a marathon only 45 seconds slower than your mile PR. That's not going to happen. Even the very best in the world do that, and so that takes endurance capabilities that nobody else has, especially if it takes you something like 3 hours or 3.5 hours to run a marathon. You're running a lot longer than the best in the world. And so, you're not going to be able to close that window between, your mile PR and the pace you can hold in a marathon. That window can only get so small, and so a good thing to shoot for is, a minute and a half. If you can run a marathon a minute and a half per mile slower than your mile PR, that's pretty good. Getting closer to a minute, that's really good. If you can run a marathon only a minute per mile slower than the fastest you can run 1 mile, that's very good for most people. A lot of the great runners do that. And so a minute and a half might be a better benchmark. But most people would be a lot slower because they don't have the endurance or they don't have the speed reserve. So spend time working on the speed reserve and then spend time working on the endurance to hold a higher fraction of that speed. Now let's see if there's some questions. Jim, speed is king, queen. That's exactly right. I mean, it all starts from the speed. And it's interesting because a lot of people gravitate toward the marathon because they think the marathon represents like the holy grail. You're not a runner if you haven't run a marathon. But it depends. I mean, is Usain Bolt not a runner? I mean, he's extremely fast at the 100 and 200 meters. I mean, is Sonia Richards-Ross not a runner because she runs the 400 meters? I mean, she's amazing at the 400 meters. So you're still a runner even if you don't run a marathon. But it's very hard to get the speed if you've never worked at it before and you've spent the last 10 years training for marathons. It's going to be tough. I mean, you're only going to be able to get so good at the marathon because you don't have the speed background. And so spend some time doing that if you're really serious about wanting to try to increase your level of performance and get to a higher level rather than just chip off a minute or 2 or 3. If you're really serious about chipping off 15 minutes, 20 minutes off your marathon, the only way that's going to happen is if you work on the speed first. Or if you're starting from like a 4-hour marathon, if you get to 3:30 without working on the speed first. But if you're already in the good recreational runner range, if you're at 3:30 for a marathon, then your goal is to chop off 15 minutes, a half an hour, then it's only going to come from, you got to have the speed reserve there first, and then work on maintaining a higher fraction or a higher percentage of that speed. Let's see. Hi, everybody. Hello from Alvarado, Texas. My coach talks about you all the time. Oh, very good. Good to know Texas is representing. Very good. Hi, Emmanuel. Hi, Jonathan. How are you? Oh, it's great to see all these people in here. So that's my short and sweet take on the marathon. Is that don't get so caught up. The endurance is important. Obviously, you have to work on the endurance for the marathon. You have to ask yourself, well, what are the limiting factors of the marathon, and then you got to train those factors. But if you're really interested in picking it up a notch and getting to a higher level, and you don't have natural speed, you haven't worked on that ever, then this is a good time to work on that first. And this is really especially a good time for it now because there aren't any races going on. We got plenty of time to train. We got plenty of time to experiment with different types of training. And so this is a great time to really do something different because you don't have a race coming up in a few weeks. This is a downtime for a lot of people. Hopefully next year races will get back on the calendar. But this is a great time to work on stuff that you wouldn't normally feel like you have the time to work on. So that's my show for today. Every show I end with a thought. And so for today's show, which is I think about our 22nd or 23rd episode, we've been doing this for a while. For today's show, my final thought of the day to close is that it's not what your muscles look like, it's what they can do that matters. And I want to tell you a little story. Back in the summer of 1994, I was living in Boston, Massachusetts. I had to do an internship for my major at Penn State. I was an exercise science major undergraduate. And I had to do an internship. And my twin brother was living in Boston because he went to Boston University. And so I got an internship with the Boston Athletic Association. I scored big time. I got an internship with the Boston Athletic Association, which, of course, as most of you know, are the organizers and the host of the Boston Marathon. I was so shocked when I got this internship that they actually have, the Boston Athletic Association has a full-time staff of people who their only job is to work on the Boston Marathon. I mean, it's insane to me. This one race that takes, one day of the year, but it takes an enormous amount of planning. There's a lot that goes into, most people don't realize, there's a lot that goes into putting on the Boston Marathon or the New York City Marathon. I mean, these major marathons, they have a whole staff of people that their job, their full-time job all year long, their full-time job all year is to work on the Boston Marathon. Insane. This was all the way back in 1994. It's even more so now. Boston Athletic Association has been around since the 1800s. They're like one of the oldest running and athletic organizations in the country. They've been around since the late 1800s. So they're steeped in a lot of history. If you ever get a chance to study the Boston Athletic Association, amazing. So anyway, I had this internship with the Boston Marathon, summer of 1994. So I moved to Boston. And around Fresh Pond in Cambridge, they had this 2.5 mile race. And it was back in the day where it was like really low-key races. There was no T-shirts. It cost like a quarter or 50 cents to run the race. And you cross the finish line, they give out popsicle sticks with your number, with your number on it, so you know what place you got. And then they collect the popsicle sticks from you, and then they can record this is the way it was done back in the old days. I feel so old telling this story. And so you get handed a popsicle stick when you cross the finish line. That's how old school this was. And it went around Fresh Pond in Cambridge, which is on the other side of the Charles River from Boston. It's where Harvard is in Cambridge. And beautiful area. If you're into New England, if you live in New England, beautiful, beautiful area. So anyway, every week, every Saturday morning, they had this Fresh Pond race. They had a series of races. It was every Saturday, all the time. And so I went over to Fresh Pond one Saturday to run the race, 2.5 miles around the pond. And on this particular day, Lynn Jennings showed up. If you don't know Lynn Jennings, she was the bronze medalist at 10,000 meters at the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona. And she was at this was in 1994, 2 years later, when she had won the bronze medal. And she shows up at this race to do it as a workout. And she was from New England, and her coach, John Babington, was there. And John Babington that day, he was looking for somebody to pace Lynn Jennings. And he saw me warming up, and he came over to me, and he asked me what pace I was going to run that day. And I said, about 5:30. And he looked at me, and he said, "You look faster, you can run 5:30. I have never had such a compliment and an insult at the same time. When he said to me, "You look like you could run faster than 5:30 pace," at the time I didn't know how to take that. I mean, I guess it was a compliment because he saw me warming up, he saw what I looked like, and he thought I could run faster. But the fact that I couldn't run faster, that was kind of insulting. So I don't think he realized it, but he gave me an insult and a compliment at the same time. So anyway, we run the race, and after when I said to him, "I'll run about 5:30 pace," he kind of was dismissive, and he went to go look for somebody else to pace his prized athlete. And so we run the race. I ran 5:35 pace that day, and I was in my early 20s. I was about 21 years old. I ran 5:35 pace that day for 2.5 miles, and Lynn Jennings was ahead of me the entire time. And ever since then, all these years later, it has come to me, I've realized that, it's not what you look like. It's not what the muscles look like. It's what they can do that matters. Yeah, I look the part. I've always looked the part of a really good runner, but I never made it to the elite level. I never even made it close. When I was a kid, my dream was to make the Olympics. I wasn't even close. And so, but I've always looked the part. And so my final thought of the day is, we get so caught up, especially with social media and what you look like. It's not what the muscles look like. It's what they can do that matters. And if you train right, you can make them do. And if you have the genetics, if you're lucky enough to have the genetics, and you combine that with smart training, then you can make those muscles do some pretty phenomenal things. All you have to do is look at the Kenyans and Ethiopians with the skinny little stick-like legs, and you watch what they can do on the track or on the road. It's phenomenal. So don't worry so much about what your muscles look like. Focus on what they can do. It's what they can do that matters. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Run Talk from our at-home studios in Southern California. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. See you next week. Have a great week. Happy Halloween.